webinar guru and
the single
co-chair until just recently. She's stepping back from the co-chair stuff, but she's got plenty else to do here. So
we all have to be IT experts now.
Yeah, that's right. And there's Christy coming in. I see Trish.
Yep. And she said she'd make herself invisible, but actually she'll already be invisible. So I did change it so that people could see the little camera. I saw that I could do that while we were live. So
great. Thanks, Trish. I'm glad I'm invisible.
Christy, you can see Barry Burden, and
right.
Christy Williams is the co-chair of our youth grants program. So she's but she's not gonna come on. I'll just do it when it's time, just for time's sake and seamless sake.
I guess we could open soon. I'm going to make myself invisible.
Are you all right then, Barry, with everything? Or do you need anything before we open up?
No, it makes total sense.
Okay. And we'll
before
Christy,
I leave,
did you have something?
Yes, I just want to thank Barry for his presentations for Carol Toussaint and Vantage Point in previous years, which I have really appreciated. One other question I have, and I don't know if you touch on it, but is there a collegiate challenge to turn out the vote this year that there was in 2020?
Sort of is the answer. I was on a call this week, something called the Big Ten Voting Challenge, which was a competition among the Big Ten schools. It's disorganized this year. They don't quite have their act together, so it's not prominent. In theory, it exists, but it's quiet.
It's one of those do it in the presidential year, but they forget about sometimes the other important ones.
Yeah, I'm gonna go ahead. Oh, sorry.
I was gonna say, it's moved from one university to another and kind of lost in translation too.
All right, Trish will open up. We will the participants will see and hear us, but we will edit it out before posting. Yep, and here they come. Welcome to those of you who are coming in from the waiting room. Welcome to the Madison Civics Club webinar on factors to watch in the 2022 elections. We will get started in just a few minutes, but if you'd like to introduce yourself in the chat, go ahead and do that. We'd love to know who's here. Maybe you can tell us, most of you, I assume, are from Madison, but maybe you're not. Tell us who you are, where you're from. Are you a Madison Civics Club member? Or since we really don't have membership going right now, or haven't since the pandemic, maybe former member would be a better way to put it. And you can also, or maybe you learned of us some other way and you're not with the Madison Civics Club. Just let us know who you are, where you're from, what organization you're with. We'd love to know. You can post that in chat. Or not. It's okay. You don't have to. People don't have to. You can be anonymous if you want to be. That's fine. Yeah, we are going to be hearing from Professor Barry Burden on the factors to watch in the 2022 elections. We will welcome your questions for him after he is done with his presentation, and there's a lot to talk about. So you can post your questions in Q&A, and we will get to them after the presentation. Oh, the chat is disabled. I was just notified. Okay, that's fine. You can introduce yourself in the Q&A section. That would be fine too. But use the Q&A section for your questions, and I will be monitoring that, and I'll present the questions to Professor Burden when he's done with his presentation. So we will also be awarding 2 youth grants after the Q&A. So I hope you will stay with us for that. Really excited to present these 2 awards. We have upped our youth grant amount to $1,000, and we're going to present $1,000 to both the La Follette High School in Madison and West High School in Madison for their get out the vote efforts and their voter education and registration efforts that they have going on. So stay with us for that. We will present that at the end of the program. And we'll give another minute or so for people to log in. We had a close to 100 people who registered for this webinar, so I want to give some time for you to get in so you don't miss anything. But we'll get started in about a minute or so. Wonderful. Do have Carrie Bowman, who has introduced herself in the Q&A. She is here representing West High School. She is working with the student group there that is doing a lot on student voter education, and she is bringing some of her students with her. So we're honored to have students as well as advisors from West and from La Follette, and we will hear from them at the end of the program. And I want to find out why voting is important to them and why voting matters and why they're involved in this effort, and hopefully leave us with some optimism for the future. All right, well, I don't want to wait too long, so we'll get started. Hello, Madison Civics Club friends. I'm Joy Cardine. I am the co-chair of the Madison Civics Club. Thanks for joining us for this fall webinar on factors to watch in the 2022 elections, which will be presented by the director of the Election Research Center and a professor of political science at UW-Madison, Barry Burden. This program is being recorded and will be posted on our website for your reviewing pleasure and for those who can't be with us today. And there is so much going on right now with the important midterms just weeks away. As you know, we have very close races in Wisconsin for governor and for U.S. Senate. Some of you may have watched the debates that were on for those races last night and the night before. A new Marquette University Law School poll came out within the past week. And as always, the political ads are ever present and usually infuriating. As civic-minded people, I know that you all agree that all elections are important, but this one is especially so, since the outcome will determine the future direction of policies and political control in Wisconsin and across the nation. Professor Burden will give us his analysis of where we stand, what's driving the vote, what's at stake, what historical patterns tell us about the possible outcome, and we will welcome your questions for him. Please type your questions in the Q&A box and I will share them with him after his presentation. And you won't want to miss our Youth Grant Awards. After the Q&A, we will hear from two Madison High School groups from La Follette and from West, who are working on making sure our newest voters are motivated and prepared for the November elections and beyond. We will present them each with $1,000 grants to keep up their good civic work. All right, let's get going. And please welcome with me our speaker, Barry Burden, a professor of political science at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is also the director of the Elections Research Center and is the Lyons Family Chair in Electoral Politics. Thank you for being with us, Professor Burden, and take it away.
Thank you so much, Joy. It is a pleasure. It's a joy, actually, to be with you all this morning. So thank you for hopping onto Zoom to spend a little time thinking about the 2022 elections. I do have some slides to share with you this morning, and hopefully those are appearing on your screen. You'll see that I'm going to be highlighting three sets of factors to watch for in this 2022 midterm. I'm asking questions as much as answering them, so I'm looking forward to the conversation we have after the presentation. But this is an opportunity for me to at least raise some of the things that I'm thinking about and trying to understand what's happening and why. 3 questions to tackle this morning. We'll start big and then work down to smaller questions at the end. First of all, should we expect the standard pattern of the president's party to lose seats in this midterm? And will that loss be bigger or smaller than usual? Second, election deniers have been in the news since 2020, if not before, and they are playing a bigger role this year. Will that vein of thinking and those activists have a lot of success this year? And then finally, let's just have a quick look at what's happening in Wisconsin in the governor's race and Senate race. So 3 sets of things. And let's start with the big one. This is the historical pattern that I think everybody in my line of work, a political science faculty, would think about when approaching a midterm election. That is the midterm loss phenomenon. If there's anything like a law of American politics, this is it. The party in the White House, the president's party, almost always suffers losses in midterm elections. It's just such a regularity. It's happened in essentially every midterm election going back to the Civil War when the 2-party system began. Not guaranteed, but a very strong pattern. So I just want to show you some evidence that happens and think about whether that loss is likely to be bigger or smaller this year. But first, let's remind ourselves of the context. What does the makeup of the federal government look like? In the House, 435 seats. Democrats have a very narrow majority. It takes 218 to have a majority there. They have 221 seats as of today. So Dems can lose 3 or 4 seats. That's it, and hold on to the House. So there's really no room to take any losses for the Democrats there. In the Senate, it's actually tighter. It's a 50-50 division. There are 48 Democrats plus 2 others who are not officially Democrats, but caucus with them. That gives the Democrats 50 votes. In a 50-50 Senate, the vice president is the tiebreaker. That's Kamala Harris, obviously another Democrat. She has set a record for, I think, the most ties broken in the Senate by a vice president, at least in the modern era. So these margins are about as narrow as you can get, which means if there's any midterm loss at all suffered by the Biden administration and Democrats, they are in some trouble. Now, all 435 House seats are up, every district in the country, including the one we're in now. But in the Senate, the seats are staggered. So only 1/3 of them are up this year. And that does affect our thinking about whether Democrats are likely to hold their 50 or gain or lose. So here's a look at where the Senate races are happening this year. It's all the states that are colored, 34 seats up this year. Red states are ones held by Republican senators. Blue currently have Democratic senators. And if you can see the states that are outlined in black, those are ones with an open seat. So a lot of interest because there's no incumbent running. Wisconsin is a little unusual that we have a Republican senator running for re-election in a state that Biden won. That's the only case of that this year. But it is one of 3 or 4 states that everyone is watching, along with Georgia, Pennsylvania, Arizona, maybe Ohio, and a few others. Nevada, I would add to that mix. So there are just a few seats that are going to determine whether Democrats end up gaining, losing, or holding where they are. Democrats may well win more votes for Senate this year and not make any gains in terms of seats, or actually win more votes nationally and lose seats. This has been the pattern for about 20 or 30 years in American politics, in the Senate at least, that the structure of the states where Democrats and Republicans tend to do well means that Democrats often succeed in winning more votes, but it doesn't translate into more seats. Some of that is a California effect. There are a lot of Democratic votes out there, but just 1 Senate seat, whereas Republicans have a lot of success in these smaller, less populous states. You can see the Dakotas, Kansas, Oklahoma, not really in doubt this year for the Republicans. So it does, although Republicans are defending more Senate seats this year, they have 20 on the ballot versus only 14 currently held by the Democrats. They don't actually need to win as many votes to keep those margins or even grow them. So let's circle back to my opening question, which is about the midterm loss phenomenon, this pattern of the president's party losing seats. And I want to show you what that pattern has looked like in the House of Representatives over time. This is where the pattern is most clear. So what you're seeing here is the number of seats in the House out of the 435 that the party in the White House either gains or loses in every midterm election from World War II till now. We could have gone further back in time. The pattern would be very similar, but this is our modern history. You can see that almost all of the bars in this figure are negative. They're headed downward, which means that the party in the White House has lost. The average loss during this time is about 25 seats. So not knowing anything else, you'd expect the party in the White House to lose about 24 seats in the House. That would clearly be enough for Democrats to lose their majority since they only have 221 seats at the moment. There are a couple of cases where the party in the White House actually gains. You can see two bumps that are positive there in 1998 and 2002. Those are some special cases we can talk about, but those are very small and rare. Before those two, I think you have to go back to the 1930s to find another case where the president's party did not lose. And the losses can be big. Sometimes it is on the order of 40 or 50 seats, which would clearly be enough to take the Democrats pretty far from their majority. So this is the pattern in the House, but it also holds in other midterm elections that are on the ballot. In the Senate, pattern is a little bumpier because there aren't as many seats up in a given year, but more often than not, the president's party would also lose seats in the Senate. It's an average of about 4 seats for the president's party. So again, plenty to take the Democrats out of their narrow majority there. There are a few more cases where the president's party will gain a seat or two. I think that's plausible this year for the Dems, but would not be what we'd expect. Also happens in governor's races. In the typical midterm election, the president's party will lose about 4 governor's spots. Those seats will be flipped from one party to the other. There's one real outlier there in the 1980s. We don't quite have an explanation for that, but set that one aside. And it's actually been every midterm election from World War II till today, which has seen the president's party lose seats. So that too is the expectation, has consequences for us in Wisconsin, where there's a closely fought governor's race we'll say a word about in a moment. But this pattern actually trickles down to state legislative seats as well. There are about 6,000 state legislators up for election this year across the states. Typical pattern is big losses, a loss of about 300 seats nationwide for the president's party. Occasionally you get a gain. There's 2002 as a small bump upward again, as we saw in the House. But more often the pattern is pretty sustained losses across the country. So this is the historic backdrop. And if we were to simply add 2022 to the end of all of these figures, you'd expect Democrats to take it on the chin in the House, the Senate, governor's races, and state legislatures, and experience some magnitude of loss. So the question I want to raise with you here is whether that loss is likely to be bigger or smaller than the historic pattern. Are there factors pushing in the Democrats' favor that might keep down their losses this year? Or are there factors that are sort of exaggerating the problem for Democrats and maybe causing them bigger than average losses? So I want to think about this sort of the way a criminal investigator would in separating out aggravating and mitigating factors. What are the aggravating factors that will make the president's party, the Democrats, lose more this year than you might expect? And then we'll walk through some of the things that might mitigate those by keeping down the losses. And I think there are sort of 4 or 5 factors to watch on each side, and how these shake out will determine exactly how the Democrats and Republicans fare this year. One aggravating factor for Democrats is that the electorate is not happy. If you look at recent surveys asking the public about their views of the president, of the Congress, of their sitting senators, of either major party, almost all of those groups have higher unfavorable ratings than favorable ratings. We would say they're underwater. That's true of, I think, every political actor in Wisconsin that is asked about in the Marquette law poll. They all have higher unfavorability than favorability. That grumpiness is likely to be taken out on people who are in office, the incumbents. And of course, in Washington, those are Democrats, a Democratic president who's not on the ballot, but Democrats in the House and Senate. Here in Wisconsin, at least statewide, at statewide level, those are Democrats. You can see the grumpiness in this survey question that Gallup has asked for many years. as to whether people are satisfied or unsatisfied with the way things are going in the country. And more people are pretty unhappy. This is about the highest level of dissatisfaction we have seen in a while. Again, that dissatisfaction is on both sides of the aisle. So there are Republicans who are unhappy with Democrats and Democrats who are unhappy with Republicans, but the generally high level of discontent is likely to work against the Democrats, who are seen as the party in power. So that's aggravating factor one for the Dems. Aggravating factor two is that the president who's in office, Joe Biden, has relatively low approval ratings, not so different from other elected officials, but it is the president who's often at the center of how voters think about midterm elections. Biden's approval rating in recent polls is sitting around 42 or 43%, with something like 55% disapproving of him. So again, he's underwater. This is dangerous territory for a president leading his party into a midterm election. To show you some evidence of that, this is from the website 538, showing approval ratings in the last half dozen midterm elections for presidents. That's in the orange column. And then in the far right, how many seats that ended up resulting in terms of gains or losses. You'll see that approval, actually, it's not the orange column, it's really the column just to the left of that that's important. That's the approval column. Both Obama and Trump in the last two midterms were sitting right about where Biden is, in the low 40s. Obama suffered a loss of 13 seats in the House. Trump was 40. Before that, Obama had been in the mid 40s, suffered 63 seat loss. That's one of the biggest in recent history. So Biden is right in that territory, looking for very sizable losses. The only two exceptions to this are the 1998 and 2002 elections we saw a moment ago. Both Clinton and George W. Bush had very high approval ratings by current standards, up in the 60s, and so managed to eke out very small bonuses. Biden is nowhere near that. So his low approval rating ought to be a warning sign for Democrats this year. Third is inflation. This is the number one concern for voters. When asked what is the most important problem facing the country, what is the issue that's most concerning you, what is the factor that will drive your vote, the cost of things, prices, gas prices, food prices, rent, is affecting every voter, and that discontent will be taken out on the Democrats, who are viewed as being largely responsible for it as the governing party. It's not that the economy is doing terribly. We are not technically in a recession by economists' definition of that term. There are lots of jobs, lots of job openings actually, and people's incomes are growing. The trouble is that the price of things is growing faster. And so their salaries, their incomes are not keeping up. Just show you some evidence of that from this figure, showing the relationship between the number of seats gained or lost by the president's party. That's on the left-hand side of the figure. Almost all those numbers are negative. Those are losses in the House. And along the bottom is a measure of people's income, but it's controlling for inflation. So it's whether their incomes have grown or shrunk relative to how much inflation is affecting it. Typically, there's growth. The economy is generally moving faster. People's incomes are rising faster than inflation, so a lot of those numbers are positive. But the latest federal statistics show that we are way down in negative territory, maybe off the graph, because people are simply not keeping up, whether it's their retirement funds or their current salaries or anything else. The cost of inflation is really making all of that worth less in real terms, and the relationship in the figures suggests Democrats are in for a hurting if that's the case, probably scores of seats lost in the House. So inflation is definitely a concern for Dems. And one more is that there is unified government. Democrats control the White House and the Congress, and studies show that when one party is in power, it is easier for voters to take out their discontent because they know who to blame. It's less clear when there's divided government, maybe the way there is in Wisconsin with parties sharing power. There, if you're unhappy, it's not as obvious who's responsible. So I showed you at the beginning that the average loss in the House for the president's party is about 25 seats. But when there is unified government, the average is actually 35 seats, as opposed to when there's divided government, it's about 16. So that figure is really hiding a very systematic pattern of bigger cost for the governing party when they are in charge of everything. So that's the cost of being in control. So these are all aggravating factors that I think are strongly working against the Democrats this year and are pushing towards bigger penalties in the midterm election. But let's think about factors on the other side, because there are some mitigating concerns that are likely to dampen the size of the losses. And I think these are not trivial as well. So what are the things that might keep down what Democrats suffered this year? One is the Supreme Court ruling overturning Roe v. Wade in early summer. This was the Dobbs decision. There was a lot of interest in that when the opinion was leaked back in May, and then more interest once the official decision was issued overturning Roe. That affected Wisconsin, obviously, where there's a law on the books from 1849, essentially outlawing abortion, but also lots of other states where there were old laws or trigger laws in place that have now made abortion illegal or more difficult. That elevated abortion as an issue. Most Americans, majority of Americans, are pro-choice. That would be the side that the Democrats are on the abortion issue as well. So making abortion more prominent really does work to the Democrats' advantage. It takes attention away from inflation and other things that are working against them, where Republicans have the upper hand, and probably mobilizes women, especially young women who are concerned about abortion rights, and could be a saving factor for them. So yes, that has been working to the Democrats' advantage. I think the question is whether that can be sustained through Election Day. This is a look from a series of surveys, 5 waves of surveys, some of which were done before the Dobbs decision, 3 of which were done afterwards, asking people what was the most important issue facing the country. Abortion was one of the answers people could give. That's typically not at the top of the list. You can see in wave 1 in the first survey back in the spring, only about 5% of people in these various categories said abortion was the top issue for them. It began to grow a bit in wave 2, especially for women, both younger and older women. But immediately after the Dobbs decision in wave 3, you can see that young women in particular move this and oftentimes to the very top of their list, maybe ahead of abortion and crime and other things that are motivating voters this year. We saw voter registration surge among women, particularly young women, in a number of states this summer. But you'll also see that in the later waves, the 4th wave of the survey and the more recent 5th wave, that has now ebbed back, not quite to where it was before the Dobbs decision was issued, but to a lower level. So I think it remains a mitigating factor. Abortion will help the Democrats do better than they otherwise would this year. But the fact that it's not holding the prominence it did this summer ought to be something of a worrying sign for Democrats. Nonetheless, I think Dobbs is one thing that will keep the Democratic losses down. The second is Donald Trump. Trump is not on the ballot. He lost the last presidential election, yet he is very involved in this election cycle. He has been holding rallies across the country in swing states, including in Wisconsin. He is in the news because of the raid that happened at Mar-a-Lago and his statements about it and the legal disputes that have transpired afterwards. It's very unusual for a president to be involved in a midterm election after they have left office, especially after they suffered a loss, and that's what took them out of office. But Trump is not shy about being a presence. Here's some evidence that Trump is playing an unusual role this year. This is for the last 5 midterm elections, the amount of Google search interest in the current president who is in office and the previous nominee, the person who had run on the other side in the last election. And setting aside 2022, you can see that previous presidents just are not factors in midterm elections. 95% of the search activity is about the current president. That's what you'd expect. Midterm elections are usually seen as a referendum on that person. But Trump has been garnering at least half of the search activity. And if you pay attention to cable news or other national media, you know that Trump continues to be a focus, both because of his own doing and because of the way the media are oriented around him. I don't think this works to the advantage of Republicans because he is unpopular, less popular than Biden in a number of polls, in swing states at least. In places like Wisconsin, I don't think it's particularly helpful to have him on the ballot. or at least perceived as being part of the decision on the ballot this fall, it transforms the election from being a simple referendum on Biden and the Democrats, and there's a lot of discontent that could be taken out on them, to a comparison of Biden and Trump. And that softens the blow for Democrats. The last time there was a comparison between Biden and Trump, Biden won that contest in 2020. So having it reframed that way, I think, works to the Republicans' disadvantage and probably allows the Democrats to get away with a little less in the way of losses this year. So Trump is mitigating factor 2. If he stayed out of it, I think Democrats would have a harder time. Factor 3, working in Democrats' favor, is that Republicans have had some trouble recruiting high-quality candidates, especially in some of these governors and Senate races around the country. Mitch McConnell, the leader in the Senate, who is leading the charge to get Republicans back to a majority there, actually used this phrase a few weeks ago, saying he was not so sure that the GOP would take back the Senate because of the quality of some of the candidates who are struggling in states where Republicans really thought they had an opportunity. Just highlight some of the folks you've probably seen in the news lately. Dr. Mehmet Oz in Pennsylvania, wealthy, well-known celebrity doctor. He has really struggled against John Fetterman in Pennsylvania. It's possible he will pull out a victory there, but that's a state where there's currently a Republican senator who's leaving office, and I think Democrats have a good shot to actually pick up one rather than keep that where it is. J.D. Vance in Ohio, celebrity author, activist, thought to be a really exciting candidate there, endorsed by Trump in the primary, may still pull it out, but has been struggling more than I think Republicans thought he would. Herschel Walker, former football star running in Georgia. You may have seen the Senate debate last night between him and Raphael Warnock. Georgia is a very competitive state, one of the top Senate races in the country, and Walker has stepped in it a number of times and really put himself in trouble. He's trailing in essentially every poll. Don Bolduc in New Hampshire, again, should be a swing state. He's an election denier and a really amateur candidate who has put himself in some jeopardy. So this is not the story in every state. There are some really high quality, interesting Republican candidates who are going to have some success this year. But in some of the key Senate races where Republicans thought they had opportunities to either hold or gain, they are squandering those because their candidates are not performing as they had hoped. So that's mitigating factor 3. Mitigating factor 4 is what a political scientist would call limited exposure for the governing party. There simply aren't as many places where Democrats are exposed and at risk of losing seats because they don't hold a lot of seats. Their margins in the Congress, as I showed, are so narrow that there just isn't a lot of fat to be given up. There aren't a lot of places where Biden had coattails and helped elect fellow Democrats in swing districts. So, the absence of those kind of marginal seats where Democrats are holding, maybe lots of states and districts that are competitive or leaning Republican, the absence of those just means there aren't as many pickups for Republicans potentially. I highlighted some of the Senate seats, but there aren't a lot of them. One indicator of that is that the number of so-called split districts has been declining over time and actually reached a record low 2 years ago in the presidential election. These are districts where the presidential winner is of one party and the congressional winner is of another party. We have, I think, one of those in Wisconsin. That's the 3rd district in the western part of the state. Ron Kind has been the Democratic incumbent there. He won again in 2020, but I think Donald Trump also won that district in 2020. So that would be a split district. There aren't many of those. It's about 5% of all congressional districts. So the absence of these mismatches means there aren't a lot of opportunities for Republicans to go in and try to win districts where Biden has been successful. Voters are so consistent now in their voting for one party up and down the ticket that it really limits the exposure of Democrats and the potential upside for Republicans. So that's mitigating factor 4. One more we'll mention is that there are some economic indicators that actually work to the Democrats' advantage. Inflation is a huge problem weighing on Democrats and is fueling a lot of Republican success. But actually on other indicators, the economy is doing pretty well. As I mentioned, we are not technically in a recession. The economy is growing pretty fast. people's incomes are not keeping up with inflation, but they are growing. So there are a lot of positives to note. This is a figure similar to the one I showed before, where the number of House seats gained or lost for the president's parties on the left-hand side. Again, most of those are negative, they are losses. But along the bottom is just growth of the economy. This is the change in per capita disposable income. It's a common indicator of how things are going. When the economy is growing more, the seat losses tend to be smaller. You can see some of the points out on the right-hand side of the figure. When growth is tepid or even negative during a recession, there tend to be bigger losses. By this indicator, the economy is going gangbusters. We are way out in positive territory, several percentage points. So if this is the kind of economy that voters have on their mind, or at least this is a consideration, then it probably softens the blow of inflation itself. Okay, so these are not answers exactly to the question of whether the midterm loss will be bigger or smaller than normal for Democrats, but I think highlights some things for at least us to think about as factors that might exaggerate or dampen those effects. So that's question one for you this morning. I want to now shift gears to think about another theme which has been on many people's minds, and that is the recent trend of election denialism or skepticism, the movement that has sort of followed Donald Trump's aspersions on the election system and has raised real questions for members of the public and now some candidates and elected officials about whether they trust election results and what they might do about it if they don't trust them. The most serious consequence of that was the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol, trying to stop or overturn the counting of the electoral votes for president. But it has manifest itself in a variety of other ways this year that are different from that. There will be no electoral votes this year, obviously, but we are watching to see what the consequences might be. You have undoubtedly seen some polls like this one showing some of the skepticism about the validity of the elections, especially on the Republican side of the aisle. This was a national survey from late last year asking people whether they thought Joe Biden's victory in 2020 was legitimate or not. Among all respondents nationally, that's the top row, about 60% say it was definitely legitimate or probably legitimate. Democrats are very sure about that. That's the bottom row. 83% say they are definitely sure that was a legitimate win. Independents a little more mixed, and Republicans downright skeptical. 46% say it was definitely not legitimate. Another quarter say probably not. So you put those two together, it's about 70% of Republicans say they are doubtful about Joe Biden's victory being proper and valid. That's a number that comes out in other surveys using other question wordings as well. So if we're a little unclear about what legitimate means, does that mean legal? Does that mean proper? Does that mean you think it was a good thing? Other kinds of question wordings also get about 70% of Republicans saying they are doubtful that the election was proper. That also affects how people are looking ahead at the 2022 midterms. This question up top, this is from the Pew Research Center, asks whether voters are confident or not confident that the congressional elections this year will be conducted fairly and accurately. Democrats are pretty confident, 40% very confident, 43% somewhat confident, so huge majority there, despite the fact that they are disadvantaged. Even though Democrats are likely to lose seats this year, they are fairly trusting of the system. Republicans, who are actually set to make some gains, are pretty evenly split, with about half saying they're not confident and the other half saying they are. Where Democrats show some concern, it's in this lower portion of the graph, asking whether respondents believe that registered voters will be allowed to cast votes as they wish in this election. Republicans are more sure about that. Democrats are a little worried about voting rights, but even confident on that side. What we don't know is whether this skepticism translates to higher turnout or lower turnout. Do the Republicans who express doubt about the integrity of elections feel as though they must vote now at higher rates to try to make up for the potential fraud in the system, to try to win by maybe a larger margin to overcome what they view as problems in the voting system? Or is it demoralizing, that it drives them away because they don't trust the system? There's a little evidence from the Georgia Senate runoffs that happened on the day before the insurrection that there was some fall off of Trump voters from the first round of the Senate elections in November to that runoff in January. Looks like it was driven by the lack of confidence, the lawsuits and the fake electors and the aspersions on absentee voting that may have just soured some of his supporters on voting as a thing. But it's very unclear whether that pattern will hold in other elections and whether it will continue this year. But it's certainly on the minds of Republican voters. It's one of the top issues that Republicans say they are concerned about in this year's elections. There are also election deniers on the ballot as candidates running for senator, governor, secretary of state, attorney general, some local offices. This is one map from 538 showing the states where those kinds of candidates are on the ballot in one office or another. This was just after the Wisconsin primary, I think, late this summer. What you'll notice is that where the candidates are more prominent who have this view, it is not exactly blue states or red states. It's not that states that have more Republicans also have more election deniers on the ballot. Rather, the election deniers have showed up more in states that are swing states. In Wisconsin, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Georgia, states that were really hotly contested in 2020 that also have important statewide races this year. We are more likely to see these kinds of candidates emerge. So it's really doubt about the outcome in states where the election was close. That's also where we saw the fake elector movement and lawsuits and other things. It does not seem to be a general concern about state election systems or absentee ballots or anything else. It's focused on these places where there was closeness and some controversy. Many of these candidates will not have success. Some of them are kind of frivolous amateur candidates who I think are not going to have a lot of victories. But there are places like Arizona and Nevada where there are really prominent candidates on the ballot who have expressed complete disbelief in the 2020 election and may actually pull out victories this fall. One aspect of all this denialism that you may have not noticed, because it's happening behind the scenes at the administrative level, is that election officials around the country are being bombarded with demands for information and materials. They are being besieged by open records requests and FOIA requests and other legal demands that they hand over voting machines or data or records or other things to members of the public, litigators, activists who want these things. These are just some headlines from around the country. It's happened here in Wisconsin, and many of these headlines are from other key swing states around the country. In Wisconsin, the Wisconsin Elections Commission is asking for funding to hire additional staff just to deal with these demands from activists who are sending them open records requests that they have to comply with by law to provide data, machines, records, copies of things. It's really bogged down election offices at a time when they are obviously preparing for an election. Absentee ballots are now out in the mail in every state. They're busy hiring poll workers and getting ballots in order, those kinds of things. This is a massive distraction that I think the public doesn't know so much about, but election officials can tell you is making their jobs really difficult in a new way this year. There are also a number of challenges being launched against individual voters. In states like Georgia, activist groups have submitted thousands of petitions or challenge documents naming individual voters they think are not eligible to vote and shouldn't be permitted to take part this fall. Whether those arguments are legitimate or not, election officials do have to go through those challenges and verify the eligibility of each of those voters. So that too is taking a lot of time as well. There are stories about election observers being recruited to be really actively involved at polling places in November, maybe challenging voters on the spot at polling places as well. I don't know whether that's going to materialize in the way that some of the media outlets have suggested, but that too is another source of concern to be watching. And some states have actually loosened up their observer rules. In places like Texas, observers can really interact with voters and get quite close to the action. So something else to watch. Okay, so this is question 2 for us to think about this morning. Will election denialism thrive in the midterm elections? it's certainly a presence. Whether it thrives or not, I think we have to wait to see. And then the third question, this is maybe the one that you woke up for this morning. What's going to happen here in Wisconsin? We have two important statewide races, a governor's race between Tony Evers and Tim Michels, who debated last night, a Senate race between incumbent Senator Ron Johnson and his challenger, Lieutenant Governor Mandela Barnes, who have debated twice now. How are those races likely to come out? I do not know is the answer. We have to let the voters make the decisions, but I will give you just a sense of what the polls are saying today. And the dynamics are different in the two races. So let's start with the Senate race between Johnson and Barnes. Johnson is the incumbent senator. He's a Republican senator in a year when Republicans have tailwinds and are likely to have success because of this midterm loss phenomenon. He does sit in a state that Joe Biden won, but I think at the outset should have been seen as the favorite against any Democrat. That said, Johnson is a controversial figure, and he's made a number of statements, done things in office that could be used against him in a campaign. Maybe reflecting that, the early polls showed that he was behind. You'll see that in late summer, after our August primary, all of the polls essentially were showing Barnes up by 3, 4, 5, sometimes more percentage points. Democrats really were excited about that. It looked like Johnson was on the ropes. But beginning about mid-September, just about a month after the primary, things began to change. And you can see that the polls get closer. And then by late September, actually the lines cross, and Johnson, at least in 3 or 4 recent polls, has been the leader. What has happened to cause this shift? One is, I think, the good feelings that Democrats had coming out of the primary when Barnes was essentially anointed as the nominee have now faded. Another is that the Dobbs decision, which was so much in the air in July and August and was working to the advantage of Democrats, has now receded as an issue, and the public has turned its attention back to inflation and other concerns. That works to Republicans' advantage. Third is that Johnson and his allies, some conservative groups, have been really effective in running ads and mailers and other kinds of communications against Barnes for several weeks, criticizing Barnes' position on criminal justice, on parole policies, on his role in the government working with Tony Evers, on what they would view as his radical views on crime, on funding police, on funding immigration enforcement, and so on. And Barnes has really not had a clear response to that or offered a clear criticism of Johnson the way I think a lot of Democrats would have expected. So there's just a more effective communication strategy on the part of the Johnson campaign, plus the tailwinds, I think, that are working to Republicans' advantage. This race is not over, but something needs to change in the next 3 weeks if Barnes is going to manage to be successful here. Governor's race is a different story. This one has been deadlocked from before the primary until today. Michels was the victor in a very difficult primary against Rebecca Clayfish, but immediately coming out of that primary was essentially tied with Tony Evers in the polls. Evers, you'll remember, was the victor 4 years ago against incumbent Scott Walker in a narrow win of just about 1 percentage point statewide, even in a year when the Democrats had tailwinds. The 2018 cycle was a good one for the Dems. And even with that tailwind, Evers just barely eked out a victory over Walker. He's going to be fighting for his job right through Election Day. I think this one could easily go either way. The polls are probably accurate there. Okay, one more thing I'll just mention and then wrap, and we can do some questions. If this kind of analysis is of interest to you, I just want to highlight another event for the civically minded, and that is a symposium that the Elections Research Center, which I direct, will be putting on December 2nd. That's just about 1 month after Election Day. It's an in-person event all day on campus at UW-Madison from 9 to 5, but we also have an online option for those of you who would like to stream in from your computers. We have a really impressive set of speakers who will be presenting that day, journalists, pollsters, academic researchers on all aspects of what happened in 2022 and before and beyond. So looks to be a fun and informative day. So we'd love to have you there. The website is listed at the bottom of the page, but you can also just Google the Elections Research Center, and I'm sure you'll find it there. So why don't I stop sharing the screen and we can move to questions.
This is Trish, the Zoom person. I'm going to start bringing the students onto the panel so we're ready to go with the youth grants. When you come in, you're going to be, your video and your microphone will be off. So just keep those off until we get to the youth grants part. It's just take a while to get everybody in. So I thought I'd go ahead and get a head start on that. Okay, I'm going away.
Okay, thanks, Trish. And thank you, Professor Burden. We do have a couple of questions. If you have a question for Professor Burden about all these different factors, really fascinating stuff. Please type it in the Q&A section and we'll get to it as many questions as we can. There's a really long one here. I'm trying to edit it in my mind, but I'll just go ahead. AO says, you mentioned 538 earlier. Nate Silver of 538 fame wrote an article about how discrepancies between expected and actual results could indicate cheating, called Baseball Between the Numbers, What Do Statistics Tell Us About Steroids? Recent articles have had titles like Vote Irregularities in Waukesha County going back years. Bannon and Trump have been very successful in calling their supporters to become those who control the electronic guts of our electoral systems, particularly in swing states. Several have been caught in unauthorized access to these systems. What analysis have you done to look for discrepancies between exit polls versus actual results in places like Waukesha, which have had these frequently reported issues with electoral irregularities? To be clear, I'm not asking about voter fraud, which has been shown repeatedly to be a non-issue.
Yeah, so I'll say a few things about this. One is I have a lot of trust in the election system. I have interacted with election officials and poll workers in Wisconsin and lots of other places. I've gotten to see how the equipment works up close. I've been involved with the Wisconsin Elections Commission and its predecessor over the years. There's no such thing as a perfect election, but we do a pretty good job. There just is nothing really systematic that concerns me. There are things I would improve, but I don't have general doubts about the outcomes of elections. I think the questioner is referring to some stories we've seen this year of access that was granted to activists. I think Steve Bannon was involved in some of those in Georgia, where one or two counties appear to have given some of the election deniers and election skeptics actually access to their voting location and machinery on election day in 2020. There's actually video and other evidence from those interactions. This is very troubling. It's just not the way that proper elections would be run, and I'm glad those have come to light and investigations are now happening. There were cases, I think, also in Michigan and Colorado of election officials giving access that they should not have to some of their friends in the community. Just not the proper way for things to happen. It's not part of the professional ethos of election officials. I do want to raise a caution about using exit polls to determine the validity of elections. I have run into a number of members of the public, even sometimes journalists, who are puzzled that the exit polls don't seem to match the election results exactly and wonder whether that could be a sign that there's something wrong with the election. It's actually a sign that there's something wrong with the exit polls. That it's an imperfect process. As you might know, the exit polls started with media outlets sending workers around the country to stand outside of polling places and interview voters as they exited the polling place. That's where it got its name. And all those surveys would be phoned into a central location, and that would give us evidence, not just of who won and lost, but of how different groups were voting. And I think the exit polls are really still quite helpful for that, to see whether men and women are casting their votes differently, or older and younger voters have different kinds of issue concerns on their minds. But exit polling has always been a challenge. It's not possible to get all of the voters or a representative sample. It's become harder in recent years because of two things. One is Democratic voters are more willing and more interested in taking part in the exit poll when they leave. So they participate more. Republican voters more often want to walk by the exit pollster, don't want to take part. So there's a strategy to try to weight the results to get back to the true result, but that's going to be a challenge. The other is with more people voting by absentee, there are fewer people at the polls. So the exit polls have to be supplemented with telephone surveys of absentee voters before election day, and then all the data put together. So they often just don't match actual election results. And I think that's fine. That's not what their goal is. In Waukesha and some other places, in some earlier presidential elections, there were cases where preliminary exit poll data were leaked on election day by a media outlet or someone on the inside. People began chattering about that during election day, and then were surprised when the results that night didn't match. But as I say, first of all, they should never be expected to match exactly. And also the leaked results from the middle of the day are not the final results. They're missing, obviously, the voters who vote late in the afternoon or in the evening, and they tend to be different politically than people who vote early in the day. So exit polls really helpful for understanding the thinking of the electorate, but I think not the right tool for deciding whether fraud or other shenanigans are happening.
Let me ask a question about turnout. The 2020, the presidential election, I remember some analysts saying that in general, cities, including Madison, maybe most specifically Madison, overvoted. A Democrat, mostly Democratic city, overvoted in that election. Turnout was way more than expected, and the rural vote was under what was expected. Do we have any idea if that's happening this time around?
Yeah, so it's really interesting to compare patterns in presidential elections like 2020 versus a midterm. There are groups that vote at very high rates in both of those kinds of elections. Older, higher income, more educated voters will be showing up this year just the way they did in 2020. There are other groups who tend to fall off in midterms. Rural voters are in that group. Younger voters, less educated, lower income, and often non-white voters see lower levels of turnout in midterms. It used to be that worked to the Democrats' disadvantage because the groups that were falling off, less educated, younger, more diverse, were groups that tended to vote Democratic. But it has changed a little bit during the Trump era because Trump has done so well among rural voters and less educated voters. And those groups are going to participate less this year. It has sort of scuttled, I think, the conventional wisdom about who's advantaged when there's higher turnout or lower turnout. One of the really interesting things in the Marquette poll this week, I think back to the Senate race we were talking about a moment ago, it showed a big margin for Johnson over Barnes. Among likely voters, Johnson was ahead by 6 points in the Marquette poll. That's bigger than about any of the other polls I've seen in recent days. But if you dig deeper into the results, if you expand the definition from a likely voter to all registered voters, it's basically a tie race for Senate in Wisconsin. So it does seem as though if the electorate were to grow this year, if turnout were higher, Democrats would probably get a boost from that. We just heard this, I think this morning, that Barack Obama is going to make a visit to the state. There'll be some other, I think, surrogates and maybe celebrities coming in to stump for the Democrats, thinking that low turnout is probably a problem for them, particularly in urban areas like Milwaukee. Madison is sort of a unicorn as cities go. Very, very high turnout, very young, but educated and upperly mobile population, one of the highest turnout places in the state. Milwaukee's a different kind of city. It suffers much more poverty. I think doesn't have the kind of civic infrastructure that Madison does. And, Madison doesn't flag in midterm years in terms of participation, but Milwaukee often does. And at least for Democrats, that's a sign of strategic worry.
On the topic of whether Republicans will be more or less motivated by distrust in the election process, is there any research into individual views on politics before the 2016 and 2020 presidential elections, given that Trump pulled in a lot of voters to the Republican Party who didn't often participate?
Yeah, it's a great question. So historically, the pattern is people who are more trusting of the election system are also more likely to vote. And that's probably a reinforcing cycle that a person participates, they get to see the election process up close, they meet their poll worker, they cast a ballot, that makes them feel more comfortable. That then spurs them to vote again in the next election. So it's sort of a virtuous cycle. And there wasn't a real partisan difference in that. The pattern before Trump was that the losers, the people who voted for the losing side, often were a little more skeptical in surveys right after the election, not quite so sure that they can be confident about the results, but that would typically fade. within a couple of months, the new person would take office, the polls would return to where they were before, and the partisan difference would sort of level out very quickly. What has changed after 2020 is that Republicans remain much more skeptical than the losing party typically does, and it has been rock solid since 2020 till today. We're still at 70%-ish of Republicans saying they don't trust the 2020 election result. I'll just say it's a little surprising because actually in 2020, Republicans did really well. Aside from losing the presidential race, they actually picked up seats in the House, almost won control of the House of Representatives. So Joe Biden had no coattails at all. He actually had negative coattails. And they made gains in a number of state legislatures and other places and almost kept the Democrats from winning control of the Senate if it were not for those two runoff elections. So the doubt among Republicans in 2020 is really Trump specific, and it has really stuck. If the historic pattern holds, you would expect the more skeptical voters, the less confident voters, to not be participating at such high rates this year. But I just don't know if that is the case anymore. I think that's probably the right expectation, but if Trump's presence and ongoing visibility in national politics keeps those voters engaged, they may want to participate despite their doubts about the system as a kind of a show of support for their party leader.
I heard that Hispanic women, particularly those in the 35 to 60-ish age range, are a huge component of the undecided vote, asks Jennifer. What role do you expect them to play in Wisconsin races this year?
Yeah, Hispanic voters generally are of really great interest, somewhat in Wisconsin, but even more so nationally. Hispanic voters participate at much lower rates than white or Black or Asian American voters. We don't quite know why that is, but there's a kind of underperformance in that group, and so a lot of potential. It's if not the fastest, one of the fastest growing minority groups in the country. Hispanics now outnumber African Americans in Wisconsin as a minority group and are growing faster. So there's tremendous potential there, but the partisan leanings of the group are also more mixed. So, among other minority groups, African Americans and Asian Americans, there's very strong support for Democratic candidates, especially among African American voters. Among Hispanic voters, there's still predominant support for Democratic candidates, but it has softened a little bit over the last few election cycles. From the mid-2000s until today, we're seeing Republicans making slightly more inroads among Hispanic voters, more in some communities than other, much more in, among Cuban Americans than among Mexican Americans, for example, but generally having more success. The abortion question being an issue this year complicates that a little bit. Hispanic voters lean Democratic, but it's not because of social issues. They're actually often more on the pro-life side than our Anglo-white voters. So I think that's exactly why this group of middle-aged Hispanic women is of some interest. They are, I think, like a lot of voters, torn between their financial concerns, their values, what they think of candidates. Immigration is an issue, but in a different way for Hispanic voters than for other voters. Crime is a concern for Hispanic voters. So I think it's the mixture of considerations and the historically low turnout patterns that make those groups of real interest. I don't think it's going to materialize in terms of a new pattern or much higher turnout rates for Hispanic voters this year, but it's probably a longer term trend to watch.
Barbara asks, how effective have the negative, sometimes or some have perceived as racist ads that Johnson has been running been on Barnes' candidacy? For example, an ad that says that Barnes stands with the criminals and not with you.
Those ads have been very effective. Those are what have turned the polls mostly that I showed you before. They've taken the attention away from abortion and other issues where Barnes probably had the upper hand. If you've seen some of these ads, television ads and mailers, my household has been bombarded with mailers on behalf of the Johnson campaign, not from Johnson himself, but from allied conservative groups. They have really linked Barnes to the unrest that happened in Kenosha following the Jacob Blake shooting there, not long after the George Floyd killing in Minneapolis. They have linked him to the Waukesha parade accident that happened last year, where a driver, African-American driver, crashed into people involved in that. And that's still a story because that trial is underway. So you have Black perpetrators involved in criminal activity that is scary to some people when they see the video or the images on the mailers. Mandela Barnes is an African-American candidate. You can't deny that there is a connection between those things. African-American candidates have not had much success at the statewide level in Wisconsin. I think in our entire state history, there have been 2 people of color elected statewide. One is Lieutenant Governor Barnes himself. So he would become sort of the third if he were to win the Senate race. There were accusations that some of the advertising colored Barnes's skin darker than it is, and created a more kind of ominous presence and heightened some of or invoked some of the racial hesitation of white voters. I think that is real. You can see it in the advertisements. And I think it's been effective at bringing crime up to the top as an issue and making it seem as though Barnes is not going to be effective in combating crime, or might actually be enabling it, as Johnson has gone that far. So that's not the only thing that has changed the polls in the Senate, but I think it's been an important part of what's happened there.
Yeah. It's just about time for me to bring on our youth grant award winners, and I'll do that in just a moment. But I wanted to ask you before I do that, Professor Burden, what is student or 18 to 30-year-old voter turnout been like lately? Is it up, down, about the same? Where do we stand, and what do we expect when it comes to the youth vote?
Well, there has been a bit of a surge among young voters these last couple of election cycles, 2018 and 2020. It's part of a broader surge in turnout. Both of those elections set records. 2020 was the highest presidential turnout in about 100 years. 2018 was the highest midterm turnout in about 100 years, and both of those were very high in Wisconsin. Older voters are already participating at pretty high rates, even before these last 2 election cycles. So the increase in turnout has been more pronounced among young voters. They have been a big part of that surge. There's still a very substantial disparity between the turnout rates of old voters and young, sometimes on the order of 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 in terms of turnout rates. So there's a lot of untapped potential there, but I think we have seen a kind of upward trajectory in recent years.
All right. Thank you, Professor Burden. I hope you can stand by as we welcome in our Youth Grant Award winners. Longtime Madison Civics Club members know that besides arranging great speakers like Professor Burden to talk about civic issues with us, this organization awards grants to school and community youth groups involved in civic work. We have not 1, but 2 youth groups to recognize today. We are awarding $1,000 grants to Madison West High School and La Follette High School to support their efforts to educate and motivate students about the importance of informed voting. We will hear from the faculty advisors and members of each group about what they are doing and why. And let me welcome in first, Dan Cromer is with us. He is the Social Studies Department Chair at La Follette High School. Are you with us, Dan?
You should be. And I can't find a couple of people. It could be that you're under an initial or a nickname. So if Elise is there, Gabby or Zoe from West, and also Ada or Ada from La Follette, if you can do the hand raise thing, I'll go ahead and promote you so you can appear on our screen here.
Okay. All right. Hello, Dan. You're with us, though. I see you now.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, very happy to have you with us. As Trish continues to try to get students on board, let me just ask you to tell us briefly, what are your students doing to increase knowledge and participation in elections?
Yeah, well, we've got our first thing coming up on Monday at lunch. We're going to get some UW students in, some board members from the Board of Education, and just going to have a pizza party to get people excited and register. We got a lot of brand new, fresh 18-year-olds in our senior class, so that's exciting. And then, like, long term, what we're looking forward to doing with this money is kind of building a mobile voter registration stand tables, chairs, Chromebooks, some signage, and then creating flyers that we could print. Colored printing is not accessible at our school, so we've got to go outside the building to get that done. So we're going to be using the money for those things.
Well, good. I'm glad it can be of good use. I'm going to have you, and we're going to circle back to the students and talk to them later, but I want you to introduce the La Follette students who we think are with us today.
Yeah, absolutely. I know we had a couple that got called into work this morning, so they're probably not here. But we've got Will Blazel is here. Zim is probably got Gabby on the Zoom with them. I see Emilio Gatica is there, and then Joanna Hoskins, some of you might know, she is the student representative to the MMSD school board, and she's we're very proud of her over at La Follette. Wonderful.
Well, certainly, those students, you can go ahead and turn your cameras on. We'd love to see you. But I'm going to welcome in our next group as well, and we'll have all of you at the same time. Let me next introduce Carrie Bowman from West High School. She advises the sifting and winnowing student group. Hi, Carrie. There you are. I see you. Hi, welcome.
Thank you.
So, tell us how you sift and winnow. I love that, by the way, as a former Wisconsin public radio host and someone who did a lot of sifting and winnowing along with the Wisconsin idea.
Exactly. First of all, thank you for having us. I teach at West High School, obviously, U.S. history, and last year I had a phenomenal group of freshmen, and now they're sophomores, and so they've come forward as student leaders and to get students civically engaged. Now they can't vote, but they're really working to get West students and faculty to be engaged. So we're going to be using the money to host, I think it's November 4th, Friday, during school, 4th period and 6th period, having 4 local public servants. I'm trying not to use politician because sometimes that has a bad connotation nowadays, but public servants. So November 4th, and then this spring with the Supreme Court election and also the city municipal elections, having candidates come in again and having our students ask questions. So we're excited for that.
Wonderful. So why don't you introduce the West students that are with us today?
I think I see Aiden Olson on here, and then Molly as well.
Okay, so what I'm going to do, Aiden and Molly, please turn your cameras on, and I'm going to start with the West students with us, and then circle back to the La Follette students. And I just very briefly from all of you, I'm just wondering, give us your thoughts on why voting matters, or why you are involved in these efforts to try to increase voter education and motivation. Let's try Molly, if you're on.
Yeah, thank you so much for having us. When Miss Bowman asked me to be part of this, I was like obviously very enthusiastic, because although I'm only 15, I can't yet vote, I think it's of very high importance to spread this like campaigning for voter registration, especially for young people. And I hope to continue getting the turnout for young people to increase, because as was mentioned in the presentation, it is one of the lower turnouts among voters, and especially with new adjustments to certain aspects, I think that it's also very important for all young people, especially in such a diverse community that is Madison, to have their voices heard in the midterm elections. So
wonderful. Aiden, how about you? Why does voting matter? Voting, especially among young people.
Yeah. Well, first, thank you for having us.
Welcome.
It's just awesome to be here, and I'm so glad I can be a part of this. But to kind of build off what Molly said, she said a really important thing. We're minors, we can't vote. And that is really important, because voting is a voice, and we don't have that yet. And so when young people push other people for that voice, the other people are representing the voiceless. And that is critical in this society, because public servants make decisions that impact us. They make decisions that affect school funding, school classes, all of it. They make decisions that impact our parents. You know, a lot of us live with our parents, and what affects them therefore affects us. And so we don't have voices. But when we push for voter turnout, we push for essentially representatives and we bring up this, and it becomes our voice. So that's why voting turnout for young people matters, because the young people are representing other young people who don't have their voice yet. And yeah, that's why it's important.
Thank you, Aiden. I'm going to move on now to our group from La Follette, and I see Johanna up first on my screen. So Johanna, why does voting matter? Why are you involved in these efforts?
So yeah, I just like to thank you guys as well. This is an amazing opportunity. So voting really matters to me because it, I guess, controls everyday aspects of our life. To begin, the school board, you vote who your school board members are, who basically control what happens in your district. It also affects prison systems, you know, how much like income you have, inflation. So voting just has like a major part of our lives that I feel like are often overlooked by younger people. And like how Aiden was saying, like we don't have a voice because we can't vote yet. So people who are 18, like they can speak for us. So that's why I think voting is really important.
Wonderful. I see Zim is next, and Zim, I think, has another student with. Go ahead, Zim, first. Can you unmute yourself? I think you're muted. Oh, maybe not. Maybe we'll work on that. Unmuting. I'm not sure if maybe something on our end is preventing you from unmuting. So Trish, if you can check into that. But in the meantime, while we're waiting for that technical glitch to be corrected, Will, are you able to unmute yourself? Will, hi, go ahead and tell us why you're involved in these efforts and why you think voting matters.
I think voting matters because the people you vote for represent you, represent what you believe in, represent basically who you are and what laws you want to have in place. So I feel like speaking up and having your voice in the community, even if you can't vote, to help people vote, to get the right laws and the right people in positions of power to then help you down the road, and to just make laws that affect you in a positive way.
Thank you. Thank you, Will. Emilio is up next. Emilio, can you unmute and put your camera on? Hi.
Hello. I would just like to say
well, that's unfortunate. I think, at least on my end, Emilio has frozen. So we might have an internet issue there, unfortunately. So, and if I'm not mistaken, I might have to, unfortunately, kind of wrap things up. I don't see Zim with us anymore. I'm not sure if that problem was corrected.
oh, am I still here?
Oh, there you are. Oh, okay, Emilio,
Yeah.
go ahead. Why does voting matter?
I think voting matters because, just to voice our beliefs and the policies that we believe in, give our community a voice.
Wonderful. Thank you all. Thank you all so very much for being with us, and congratulations. $1,000 to each school to keep up the really good work in voter education and voter participation. Kind of gives me a little bit of hope for the future too, to see so many involved in this. And we will, as they say, put the check in the mail. So normally if we were in person, we would present it to you right now, but it'll be on its way soon. I promise. Thank you, Dan and Carrie, very much for all of your efforts. And let me take a moment to also thank all teachers at our schools that are really doing a great job especially in these times of teacher shortages and staff shortages, and with all the pressures that are still there when it comes to the ongoing pandemic. So thank you, Dan. Thank you, Carrie. Thank you to all teachers for all you do to educate our youth. So, and we look forward to your future efforts. And Barry, thanks again for being with us. Maybe just before we let everybody go, do you think we're gonna know Wednesday morning the outcome of the midterms, or is this going to be one of those weeks on end figuring out what happened?
The one to watch, I think, is the Georgia Senate race, because in Georgia, a candidate has to get 50% of the vote to settle the election. And if not, there's a runoff. That's why we had the 2 runoffs in 2020. I think it's likely that the Warnock-Walker race there won't allow either candidate to get to 50%. That means there'll be a runoff in December. I think it's December 6th. And that could hold the power balance in the Senate up in the air for a month at least.
Yeah. And one final question on Wisconsin. I mean, this is a big deal in Wisconsin, and we heard your factors for and against how incumbents might do and Democrats might do. If Governor Evers is defeated and Republicans gain even more seats in our state legislature, Wisconsin could be seeing a whole lot of different policies passed. Isn't that right?
Yeah, the governor's race is really the most important moving piece in state politics. The legislature is controlled by Republicans, and I don't think anyone doubts that they will keep their majority because of the way the districts favor them at the moment. They might actually make enough gains, they would have a supermajority, enough maybe to override a governor's veto potentially. If Evers stays in power, I think we keep the stalemate we have of a governor and a legislature not getting along, and lots of bills being vetoed and lawsuits back and forth to settle things. But if Michaels is elected, Republicans, I think, are ready to go with a lot of policy initiatives on taxes and environmental regulations, some other things you heard in the debate last night. So it matters a lot who is governor for the future of the state for the next 4 years at least.
I'll leave it there. I wish we had more time. We said we'd wrap up by 11:15, and I've already gone over. So thank you all very much for being with us. We really appreciate it. We'll follow up on some of these issues in future Madison Civic Club's programs. I would also like to take a moment to thank our Youth Grants Chair for the Madison Civics Club, Christy Williams, and club member Barbara Arnold, who both identify groups deserving of youth grants and encourage them to apply on our website, MadisonCivicsClub.org. You can do the same if you're aware of a youth group, or you're involved in a youth group and know of one deserving of a financial boost. Tell them to apply for a Madison Civics Club youth grant. And thanks to our webmaster and Zoom guru, Trish Yacarino, who after many years decided to step down as co-chair of the Madison Civics Club earlier this year. We are grateful for her many years of service and happy she will continue to help with our website and technology for the time being. The board appointed Jennifer Fagan as the new co-chair of the Madison Civics Club. We are very happy to have her as the new co-chair. And Jill Jokola is the new secretary of the Madison Civics Club board. Luann Quella continues to be irreplaceable, as much as she'd like to be, as treasurer of the Madison Civics Club. So thanks to all of them. The next Madison Civics Club program will likely be a virtual program in January because it'll be winter and nobody wants to drive anywhere. And we will try to put our next in-person program together in the spring, and we'll keep you posted on that. On behalf of the Madison Civics Club, I'm Joy Cardine. Be sure to vote and remind a friend or 3 or 4 to vote too. See you next time.